And so the next speaker we have coming up is Alex Baldwin. So Alex Baldwin is an engineer and researcher in the bioelectronics space. Since 2023, he has been a part of USC's Center for Autonomic Recording and Stimulation System, also known as CARS, where he is helping develop a community around the OpenNerve open source implant. Please join us in welcoming Alex and his talk, Pursuing an Open Source Active Implantable Medical Device, Lessons from OpenNerve So Far.
Thanks a bunch, Yves. So like Yves mentioned, I'm part of a much larger group that's working on an open source device, an implant actually, for autonomic neuromodulation. We're headquartered at the USC with private partners MedAlly and Medipace. I'm going to start off the talk by talking a little bit about the challenges that we face as a very high-risk device, an active implant, and sort of at least where we sort of see the space for open source in the class 3 medical devices. Then I'll go a little bit into our project and the design choices we made to try to take advantage of the opportunities. So just to start at the very basics, every medical device has a lot of risks associated with it, obviously. There's things that could go wrong if a medical device breaks. There's things that go wrong if somebody designed it incorrectly or if it's manufactured incorrectly, manufactured by, say, a third party, or manufactured by even as simple as a technician who wasn't properly trained. And then, of course, there's plenty of things that could go wrong if the device is misused. And this could be somebody sort of intentionally misusing it, or like a hacker breaking cybersecurity, or even somebody who wasn't properly trained on it or didn't have proper instructions. Because of the high risks that are involved with medical devices, as I'm sure all of you know, almost every country has some sort of regulatory body that sets certain testing requirements and certain documentation requirements before they will allow these devices to be used in humans. I'm based in the US, as many of you are. In the US, the FDA is what controls this. And the FDA sort of sets different requirements based on risk classification in 3 levels, right? There's the relatively low risk devices, there's moderate risk, and then there's these class 3 high risk devices. I know that I would love to talk to many people. If any of you have experience in other regulatory systems, I wish Jen was here. I wanted to talk to her about the Canadian system. All right, I'm talking to you after this. But it is worth noting that the FDA system is sort of, there's reciprocity and there's the ability for other countries, or I guess other countries have agreed to use these same classifications and accept these same tests. So you can see this is widely applicable to many other places in the world. Some examples of class 3 devices from the FDA include these following devices. So these would be devices that are life-sustaining. So if they're not working, then the person using them would die, something like a pacemaker. They also include devices that may kill or seriously harm a patient if the device malfunctions, or if it's not manufactured correctly, if it breaks somehow. Something like a coronary stent, where if it causes a thrombosis, that could present an immediate life risk. It also involves devices that are chronically implanted. So these are devices that might not necessarily be life-sustaining, but because they are complex and they're in the body for long periods of time, they have a lot of risks associated with them. This would be something like a cochlear implant or like the OpenNerve device that we're developing. Now the FDA, and by the way, I am not at all a regulatory expert. So if anybody is, please feel free to correct me after this, or I'd just love to chat with you about this. But as an engineer, my understanding is that the FDA has a huge list of requirements that class 3 devices must go through before they ever get into humans. These start at the very start of the design stage, where design must be developed under a quality management system. There's a lot of documentation that goes into this, including risk and hazard analysis, thinking through every single risk and then designing in order to mitigate all of those risks. You have to have design inputs and have a very clear path between design inputs and design outputs. So you have to sort of know what you're designing before you even start and document the whole way. This lends to what the FDA recommends as a waterfall design, where you sort of start at the design, you go through this very clear linear process, and then at the end you lock the design before ever going into humans. Also, anything has to be manufactured under GMP, good manufacturing practices. This involves documenting and regulating who gets to manufacture the devices, making sure everybody's well trained, making sure everything's done repeatably and exactly the same way each time, and done in a facility that can document all of this and can be audited to make sure that it's compliant. Beyond the design stage, there's also a huge amount of requirements around benchtop testing. This includes things such as biocompatibility testing, making sure that nothing dangerous is leaching out of the device or that the materials won't interact with the body badly. It also involves, especially for our type of device, a lot of electrical testing, making sure that your device won't electromagnetically interfere with other things in the hospital, or making sure other things in the hospital won't interfere with it in a way that causes damage or could hurt the patient. And then there's the list goes on, but it goes down to even testing and validating the package you use, validating the labeling that you use. There's very specific standards behind labeling, and of course, testing and verifying sterilization and verifying the shelf life of the sterilization, making sure you can keep that if you've sterilized and manufactured something correctly and then put it on the shelf for 6 months, it still won't cause any new risks or increase any risks or any probabilities. Now, beyond that, after going through all of the benchtop studies and manufacturing correctly, you also have to do, in almost all cases, a safety study in animals. So for class 3 devices, it's, again, I'm not a regulatory expert, so feel free to tell me the exceptions to this rule. But as far as I know, it's almost always required to do safety studies in animals in order to show that the device is ready for human use and won't cause any harms or that there aren't any risks present that weren't identified during that benchtop write-up. After that, after going through all that, you're finally allowed to submit what's called an IDE, an investigational device exemption. And this IDE is for a specific limited clinical study. And basically you go back and forth with the FDA, tell them everything you've done. They usually give some feedback, ask for more information. And after all of that, you're allowed to finally use your device in a person for the first time. I think it's worth noting for an IDE, this only works for a single clinical study. This is very limited. You have to give the clinical plan up front. And even after this, you have to go through a lot more to use it again, right? You might need a new large animal study if, say, you're going to change the device configuration or use it for a slightly different indication. If you want widespread use, if you want doctors to just be able to prescribe this, you have to go through multiple clinical trials, usually a pilot trial, very small trial to show safety, and then a much, much larger trial to prove efficacy. Even after that, if you want a class 3 device to be used in the hospital, a lot of training and communicating with individual hospital surgeons, individual hospital systems has to be done. For most implants, doctors and surgeons will usually require some sort of technical support from the group designing the device in the OR so that they can show them how to use it, how to properly implant it, how to program it, things like that. The FDA also requires post-market surveillance, meaning that if anything goes wrong in a patient after the fact, you have to be constantly monitoring for this and then adjust those risk matrices in real time and make any design changes necessary to mitigate or ameliorate any new risks that might crop up. And then finally, you have to continue manufacturing these devices under a QMS, under GMP, and the FDA will regularly audit you and make sure that you're going through all the steps correctly and that there's nothing wrong with your system. So that is a lot. To sort of summarize what the FDA expects, and this is from a little bit of a philosophical perspective, but they expect centralized controlled development, right? They expect something where there's a linear progression between the design inputs and the design outputs. They also expect identical devices. So every device is made the same way, is made under the same process, is made under a way that's been tested and proven to be safe. They expect things to be done with a single indication, meaning a single disease, and a single device configuration. Again, regulatory people, tell me all the exceptions later, please. But as far as I understand, having a different indication for the same exact device or changing the configuration of your device a little bit, that is considered a brand new device under the FDA and requires new testing and new paperwork. And then finally, the FDA wants centralization and a consistent contact for audits and for recording those adverse events, making sure that the patient stays safe and that any sort of problems that crop up are addressed. At this point, I think it's worth noting the FDA is great. All my interactions with the FDA have been amazing, and the people there are incredibly helpful and will really work with you to understand these steps and to go through them. I've never had a bad interaction with FDA people. But it's important to note that they are focused on patient safety. And while they really try to get new technology to the clinic, their job and their mandate is to make sure that's done in a safe way. One of the results of all this is that development costs, especially for a class 3 medical device like we're developing, are incredibly high, Right. This is from a 2022 study that tried to look at the average cost of developing a class 3 medical device in the US. And they found that before getting approval, the average cost was over, I think, $52, $53 million. And if you look, $20 million was spent on average before ever getting to the first human. So the first study in people. Then there was a small amount of money for the pilot study, and the majority of that cost, over $30 million, for the pivotal clinical study. Obviously, for an open source group, this can look very prohibitive. I think that also something that I'm learning more about open source community and talking to all of you guys is I'm realizing there's also a little bit of a little bit of a tension between what the FDA sort of wants or what's required from a regulatory and a patient safety side, and like the ethos and the reason many people get into open source devices, right? Something that I've heard from a lot of you guys is that for open source, you value personalization, making sure everybody gets a device that meets their specific needs and is able to adjust that device, is able to adjust what they're doing to their own body, and has the freedom to sort of control what's happening to their body. I've heard that distributed manufacturing, whether that's each hospital having their own manufacturing, or whether that's places, countries, or low-income locations that might not have big fancy facilities, that's something that is really a big push from open source. And like I mentioned just a second ago, empowering patients, letting them have control. As much as I think empowering patients and getting devices to market is a goal of the people at the FDA, since their focus is on safety, they and other regulatory bodies value things like control, repeatability, centralization, having one manufacturer to contact, having a rigorous process, and frankly, things that I think do conflict with the open source ethos that many of you have expressed, and also would do things like increase cost and sort of make it more difficult, especially for a high risk device, to get to the market. So the question that I've been sort of struggling with, or the question that I've been asking myself as I am part of this OpenNerve project is there even a place for open source development for these high risk medical devices, for these class 3 devices? And obviously I wouldn't be here if I didn't think the answer is yes. I do believe that there are a lot of problems with the existing sort of the way that class 3 devices go through that open source devices are uniquely able to solve. I'll go through a couple of these in a second, but I really do think that even though it is very difficult for an open source distributed group to get a class 3 device to the hospital, trying and really putting effort into creating these sort of open high risk devices will help in a number of ways in both the patient side as well as for researchers and doctors that are trying to develop new therapies. The first and probably the most obvious way that I hope that open source medical devices will help is by lowering those development costs, right? Like the majority of the costs are taken up by the clinical trials, but there is a lot of money spent on just developing a new device and going through all of those processes before you ever get to first in human, even before you ever get to animal tests. I know from talking to a number of startups as well as working at a company of my own, not my company, being an employee at a startup in the past, millions of dollars can be spent redeveloping the same or very similar device before even going through all the testing plans or even doing animal studies. By reducing these costs and by even taking that chunk of the pie chart and shrinking it just a little bit, every little bit you shrink it, I believe leads to more patients getting therapies they need and lowers the barriers to groups such as nonprofits, academic startups, or even, academic groups, or even startups from entering the field and competing with those larger companies that are out there. Another place that I think open source can really help, especially in the class 3 medical devices, is in the case of abandoned devices. Now, there whole lectures could be written or could be spoken about abandoned devices. To summarize, this problem basically boils down to there are many devices that work that aren't commercially viable. And so either a large company will do a clinical trial, implant a lot of devices, and then decide it's not worth them pursuing, or maybe more commonly, probably, a startup or an academic group will have great results on the clinical side, but just won't have the money to sustain themselves and will cease operation. We see this over and over again. I put 3 examples up here. One of them from my own backyard is the second sight artificial retina. This was a device that actually did gain FDA approval. This is an implant into the eye and then an external device that gives some rudimentary sight back. It was implanted in, I believe, about 450 patients. But after that, they weren't able to make money. And so they went out of business, and these patients were literally and figuratively left in the dark. So the device was still operating, and in some cases was absolutely life-changing and really improved their quality of life significantly. But if a part broke, especially like on the external device, how are they going to fix it? If there was a problem, if there was an infection, if there was an issue, how did they know the specs of that device or the risks or how to explant it safely, right? Many patients didn't even know if they could get an MRI. There's just no way of sort of helping these patients after this company went under. Another device that had a similar issue several years ago is the freehand system. This was for upper body paralysis. This was a functional electrical stimulation implant that allowed the patient to sort of directly stimulate muscles and gain some arm and hand movement back. This was a device that was also spun out into a startup. That startup went under, even though patients they loved the device. And I've actually met patients now 30 years later that are still using the device and benefiting from it every day. This, I'll give you sort of a preview of tomorrow. So this device actually has a happy ending in that researchers from Case Western University were able to sort of semi-legally acquire the IP back and continue supporting these devices. And this has actually evolved into what you'll see tomorrow as the Cosmic System, which my friend Chris Rexroth will present. So happy ending there, and one that's tying back into open source, luckily. And then another one sort of even more sort of connected to our project is the Brindley stimulator. This is a device that stimulates the sacral nerves for people with lower body paralysis to give back bladder, bowel, and sexual function. Really life-changing for so many people. But because it's not commercially viable, it's no longer manufactured. Replacement parts aren't manufactured. I know personally people that are trying to get this back, but it's a long road because everything's proprietary and the company just couldn't sustain itself. So one thing I think there's several things that open source devices could do to help with this. And to be clear, this would be creating devices under an open source model that could then, if there is an issue on the commercial side, all the material would then be open source for others to help, to sustain, to perform maintenance on, and to maybe pick this up in the future. So some examples of ways that open source devices could help with this abandoned device problem include having the actual source files open could allow firmware and software updates, both to fix cybersecurity issues, new risks, or to update, for example, if you have a commercial cell phone as a controller, you need to have it work on a new cell phone, that needs a new software update. You could also be used to create replacement parts, whether it's 3D printing, CAD, or even electronics parts for the external devices. Stuff like open documentation, having those risk analysis out there, having the protocols live out there. That could allow future doctors to do surgery on these more safely, could allow more confidence around things like MRI safety. And it could allow new manufacturers to pick these up and continue selling a device they would still have to go through many processes with the FDA, but it would reduce that cost and it would lower the barrier to entry for re-bringing this device to the market. And then finally, one way that I think that open source could help with abandoned devices is by opening up protocols, whether that's communication protocols or say connector designs. This could allow parts to be replaced with equivalent parts with very minimal risk. For example, if you had a spinal cord stimulator and the battery ran out, you could potentially leave the leads inside, replace the actual pulse generator with a commercial one from a larger company, from a different company. And you could have confidence that those would interact correctly and that you could safely set the correct amount of stimulation. If you had those protocols and the design files and say the electrode designs, the electrode sizes, if all of that was open. So that's one way I think that open source could help. Another way I think open source could really help is in the preclinical side, right? I mentioned that almost all of these devices have to go through animal studies. Actually, one of the biggest if you look holistically at the development of class 3 medical devices in general, many of them fail at either the pilot study or at this preclinical side because the devices just don't work or aren't reliable in animal studies, or because those animal studies aren't able to translate to humans in a cost-effective way. One way that I think that open source devices could help is to allow to give a sort of a low cost and a low barrier of entry way of doing studies in animals with devices that could be easily translated to the clinic and that have been tested and gone through this rigorous process, and so are hopefully more reliable than some of the research devices that are currently used for animal studies. Or, for example, devices or boards that like an individual research lab would put together. They would have to go through that whole development process afterwards if they got good results. So this would hopefully skip them that step and save them millions of dollars, several years in getting this to market or to patients. And then finally, just going back to the cost thing, there are a lot of large companies that are able to sustain the cost of developing these expensive medical devices, but there's orders of magnitude more startups or small businesses that have brilliant ideas and might have some really good clinical or preclinical evidence that just aren't able to get to market. So I think having open source devices, whether as a device that companies can actually use and like conduct their studies with an open source device, or even having a reference design out there, having something out there that companies could look at and say like, oh, okay, this version works. Here's the schematic. Here's the bill of materials. Here's the CAD. I might need something slightly different, but I at least know something that works, and I know the pathway to getting to humans. I think this is really important, not just for lowering those barriers, but also for sort of bringing in people that aren't involved in the medical device world or that maybe don't have connection to the FDA, haven't gone through this again. This lets them see the roadmap and see exactly what they need to do to be successful. All right, so that's a lot of very, I guess, theoretical stuff. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about our project. So, as I said, I'm part of a much larger project working on OpenNerve. OpenNerve is an open source implant for neuromodulation of the autonomic nervous system. I can't remember if I already said this, but autonomic nervous system, this means the nerves that aren't the brain and spinal cord. This would be nerves that go to things like the heart, the lungs, the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, nerves that control those sort of automatic functions of your body, the ones you don't have to think about. What we want to do is develop a whole system, a whole platform that consists of an IPG, an implantable pulse generator, and then a number of different sensors for biosignals, as well as electrodes to stimulate the body, and then allow people in the community to create new therapies using that platform, mixing and matching those sensors and those leads to what they need, and then going through all of the preclinical and the clinical tests to actually get that new therapy to market. Oh, and again, I can't remember if I said this in the first slide, but we're a consortium. We're headed at the University of Southern California by Dr. Ellis Meng. But we also have two commercial partners. MedAlly, who is a contract manufacturer based out of South Carolina that does other medical devices, has a lot of great experience. And then MediPace, which is a startup based near Los Angeles that has actually gone through the process and has devices in humans before. And so they've both been incredibly helpful in sort of showing us the path and all the other stuff that needs to happen in terms of actually getting to market. There's many different components of OpenNerve. I can go over these later with you if you'd like, both on the established side that can be manufactured under QMS, as well as more research type devices that will give next generation capabilities. And we're currently in the stage of supporting a number of large animal studies by both academic partners and commercial partners that will hopefully be successful and then translate into human studies. We're also working on developing a stock of devices to make the path to market shorter, to get devices into people's hands quicker. And we're making development boards that are currently being manufactured for people in preclinical or who want to do benchtop studies. All of our source files are available on GitHub. I can go over all these later with you guys if you want. But we're basically releasing things as we develop and releasing all of these under the Creative Commons CC BY open source license. So no share alike clause, all that's needed is attribution. So cite us. I know I don't have too much time left, so I'll skip ahead a bit. The next couple slides, I'm just going to go over a couple design choices that we as a group have made about OpenNerve that we think will hopefully enable those promises of class 3 medical devices, or at least that's the intent. One of those design choices we made is to really lean into both modularity and compatibility with existing devices. I mentioned that there's a huge amount of leads being either sensors or electrodes that can plug into that central implantable pulse generator. We're trying to make those as swappable as possible, give people a huge amount of options to use, and then using things like splitters or interconnects allow any combination of leads to be used with the same IPG, allowing our one device to hopefully address many different therapies. We're also trying to keep it as compatible with existing standards as possible. This means using Bluetooth for communication instead of using a custom like mixed band standard. This means using ball seal connectors for our headers, even though anybody in here who knows probably hates ball seal, but they are the standard and they're used by commercial leads. So we're using the same size and the same connectors as, say, Boston Scientific's leads. So you could use a commercial lead with our IPG. We're also trying to keep as familiar a form factor as possible. As you can see, this looks very traditional-ish, or something that a surgeon would look at and immediately know what to implant or how to implant it. We're also trying to increase device availability in a number of ways. We know that not everybody can build one of these from scratch, so we're working with our partner, who is the contract manufacturer, MedAlly, to both develop a stock of devices as well as to just be available for any sort of customization and be a contact point to sustain these devices if people do want to manufacture for a clinical study. On the other hand, we're also working on internally manufacturing a number of low-cost versions of these that can be distributed to people who just want to sort of get an intro to our platform and do initial development, firmware development, maybe small animal studies using it. We want to lower the barriers to entry as much as possible, and we're trying to not assume that people have the technical expertise to manufacture these on their own. Something that I won't go too into, but that we're just starting, will hopefully release in the future, is versions of firmware and software that are sort of safety locked, where we might have an API or we have a certain portion of the code that is, you can mess with it and modify it as much as you want, while having confidence that none of the core critical patient safety sort of portions or functions are touched. So this would allow hopefully flexibility and modularity while maintaining a lot of the patient safety. And then something that I think is a bit of a trade-off between the needs of the class 3 devices and the ethos of open source, but somewhere where we're trying to sort of stay in the middle and enable both, is just allowing groups to build proprietary therapies on top of our technology. So in order to get our open technology to clinical trials requires a lot of money, right? Even if we take that $20 million and we're able to shrink that down to like almost nothing, a pivotal clinical trial is still $30 million, or could be 30 million or more. In order to raise that money, venture capitalists or large firms, they want to see something proprietary. And so while we don't want to limit what we're doing, and we don't want to put any sort of barriers to people using our stuff, we do want groups to be able to build proprietary technology on top of our platform. This could be new firmware, this could be a special algorithm, or maybe a custom patented lead that plugs into our IPG. One of the reasons why we've chosen the CC-BY license is to enable that, right? We're not restricting, we're not doing a share-alike clause, and we're very much encouraging groups to take our open platform and do everything that they need to sustainably get that to the patients and get it into the clinic. And this includes sort of going private and creating closed source technology on top of it. Having said that, we really do want to encourage people to contribute back. And one of the things we're constantly looking for is groups that will contribute both the data that they're producing as well as any new designs back. We're lucky enough to have found several of those with our animal studies ongoing. Our goal right now, like I said, we're in early stages. So our goal right now is to get to our first in human and get to it in such a way that the communication with the FDA, or the not necessarily clinical data generated, but the benchtop data generated in support of that, can all be released as open source as well. Another thing that we'll be doing in the future is trying to grow our community and go from just being sort of designers and people that enable these researchers to having this back and forth between many different research groups that are actually developing on top of OpenNerve and improving the system. This is something I really liked Kara's talk about open source leg. We're definitely going to be inspired by that project as we move forward in the next year or so. Again, I know I'm out of time, so I just want to briefly say thank you to the many, many people involved in this. Alice Meng, who's been leading the project or originated it, all the groups at USC, MedAlly, Medipace. Our external advisory committee has actually been really great, meeting with us and sort of showing us what is needed by the field. And then, of course, the NIH, who's really had this vision of funding open source implants before anybody, and funded this project and continues to support us to this day. So yeah, thank you very much. Feel free to come ask me any questions or reach out by email. All of our stuff's on GitHub, and I would love to talk to you about any of it. Also, as an academic, I'd be remiss if I didn't pitch our latest paper. So please come. I wrote a paper as part with our group about sort of kind of what I talked about, looking at open source devices and like what's actually needed to build sustainable open source devices. I pitched this kind of at people like me, medical device developers who aren't familiar with open source, but I'd love if you guys all checked it out and gave me any feedback you had. So yeah, thank you.